From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
The Garden of Paris by Eric Williams. The messenger distributing mail to the various ministerial offices occupying the top floor of the Palais de Chaillot, Paris, reached into the bag hanging from his shoulder and extracted one last bundle. It was a thick packet of odd-shaped and colored envelopes, all torn open in varying degrees of impatience, and all with 2 words scrawled across each: Delacroix Chaillot. The messenger gave his habitual groan of disgust and plodded to the end of the corridor, where he ascended a short flight of stone steps that led out of one wall and led to a redwood door upon a small landing. A card tacked to the door announced, Monsieur Delacroix, Uno. The messenger opened the door and said in an irritated voice, Good morning, Mademoiselle Lamoureux. Early as usual? The office was small, its ceiling low, its 2 windows made to look small by virtue of the overhanging eaves just above them, and the whole effect of cramp exaggerated by 2 large, old-fashioned desks, and equally as dated filing cabinets that occupied all but various narrow lanes on the floor. Mademoiselle took the proffered bundle with the barest of smiles. She did not deign to answer the implied criticism, which had been put in one form or another almost daily for the past 10 years. How could you explain that she came early through love for her boss? She had loved him for 20 years, but 10 years ago, being by chance early in the office, she had arranged all the letters in alphabetic order of sender's name, and this had pleased him very much. Since then, she had done him this ridiculous service each morning at the cost of 20 minutes of her own times per day. She knew that now if she omitted to do this gratuitous act, he would be most ill-pleased and think her remiss. Not that her love could ever be assuaged or even revealed, since Monsieur Delacroix was a most respectable man and had been married 15 years. But the habit of love died hard in her breast, and every day she allowed Monsieur Delacroix to be a king in his office, speaking only when she sensed he required talk, making his coffee, cleaning his desk, not moving while he thought, and being altogether an inferior being. Monsieur Delacroix held a peculiar position in Uno. To his office were sent each day all those letters which Uno, by virtue of its idealistic nature, attracts from thousands of idealists who insist they have a scheme or information that must be acted upon for the good of mankind. These writers are a persistent race and pester the various offices of Uno year in and year out with their letters. Mixed with these ravings, and often indistinguishable to the unpractised eye, is the occasional far-fetched but pregnant scheme, and the anonymous warning with real information. Paris set Monsieur Delacroix up in a remote office, out of reach of the more insistent evangelist, and appointed him to answer the crank and sift out the gold from the brass. He did this job thoroughly, and better than most. His mind was so uncomplicated and literal in its appraisal of things that he had much in common with the people who wrote the letters he was given to answer, and was thus able to sense unbridled sincerity when he read it, and to discard it. Whenever, on the other hand, he encountered the flavor of sincerity plus knowledge, he investigated. This morning, after the unvarying succession of actions and words that accompany his entry and passage across the office each day, he picked up the pile of letters, placed them in the middle of the blotting pad before him, saying, without really listening for an answer, "Anything interesting, mademoiselle?" He was already intent upon opening the first letter, which was written by a Monsieur Abim. He read, "Once again I have to report that I heard a scream from the grounds of the Jardin des Plantes. This was at 3 during the morning of September 6. On looking from my window I saw, as on other occasions, lights shining through the trees of the grounds. I am convinced that we have here in the heart of Paris a cell of the sinister Union d'Execution, set up by Moscow, and of which I have sent you many details. I pray you to hasten to eradicate this nauseous limb of..." Monsieur Delacroix did not read on. His inner ear had caught something. Across the top of the letter was written, "Please answer. This character has written us and the police 50-odd letters over the past 5 years. There is nothing in it. Put him off. Vesta extension 7211. Monsieur Delacroix picked up the phone and asked for Monsieur Vesta's number. "Hello," said a high-pitched, genial voice. Monsieur Delacroix introduced himself. "I would like to see some of those other letters," he said, "and if you have it, the report of the investigation. I don't feel I can answer properly without a bit more background." "Certainly, certainly. I have a complete file here, police correspondence and everything. I'll send it along. Only for heaven's sake, get him off my neck. I'll be getting nightmares if I read many more of those things about screams in the night." 2 days later, Monsieur Delacroix felt himself in a position to write to Monsieur Abim. Vesta had not exaggerated. There were 50 letters in the file, plus correspondence between Uno and the police requesting investigation of the matter, and a long report adding up to very little except that these letters always came at or near full moon, and as no murders were actually committed in the grounds of the Jardin des Plantes, it could only be assumed that Monsieur Abime was affected by the full moon. Monsieur Delacroix dictated a police letter, expressing interest and suggesting that both he and Monsieur Abime should keep vigil together at the next full moon in 8 days' time, in the hope of hearing screams issuing from the Jardin des Plantes. His suggestion was accepted by return post. In the intervening weekend, Monsieur Delacroix took his family to the Jardin des Plantes to get a clear picture in his mind of the layout of this park. Cum zoo, cum botanical school, cum museum. He himself had not been to the Jardin since his teens, when he remembered taking a young lady to see the monkeys, but his children knew the place well and unerringly led their parents to the most sensational of the animals, and then at their father's request to the labyrinth adjacent to Rue Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, where Monsieur Abime had his flat. They climbed the spiral track around the tree-covered hillock that comprised the labyrinth, but they were unable to reach the derelict gazebo on the crest, as the path had been railed off by the authorities. Monsieur Delacroix stood for some moments at this highest permissible point, surveying the probable scene of Monsieur Abime's reported screams. The place was quite wild and tangled in shrubbery. The paths were edged with high iron-rod fences that precluded any possibility of sightseers leaving the path, although Monsieur Delacroix could see no reason to protect what seemed such a dreary, untidy wilderness. Below, through the trees, he could see the administration buildings on the left and the hothouses on the right. Beyond the administration buildings would be the zoo, and beyond the hothouses the formal beds of the botanical gardens. 50 or so meters behind him was the wall of the Jardin, with the noise of occasional traffic echoing from the tall, concrete-fronted buildings overlooking the Jardin from the other side of the street. This corner of the Jardin seemed old and forgotten and drear, as if the vitality of the soil had been used up. "I feel cold," complained Madame Delacroix. "I don't like this place. What are you up to, standing there like Napoleon watching Moscow?" Monsieur Delacroix in no way resembled Napoleon at Moscow, except perhaps that he too was suddenly cold. He took Madame Delacroix's arm and briskly walked her down to the sunlight at the foot of the mound. "I shall be watching the hill from across the road next Wednesday night," he told her. "I wish to see it at close hand before then. I must say I'm disappointed in the place." Madame Delacroix gave her husband a penetrating look, but simply said, "You will be careful, dear?" To which Monsieur Delacroix replied, "Let's go into the cactus house. I'm chilled. It's as cold as the morgue under those trees." Being early September, it was quite dark when Monsieur Delacroix rang the bell which announced him to Monsieur Abimai's apartment. There was a long pause, and then the tall wooden door opened, and a shadowy figure in the dim-lit vestibule asked Monsieur Delacroix to enter. "We have no concierge," apologized Monsieur Abimai, leading the way into an elevator just large enough to accommodate them both. "My place is on the top floor." The elevator rose with obvious effort to the 4th floor. Monsieur Abimai had left the door of his apartment open and showed Monsieur Delacroix directly into the well-lit lounge. "This building is very quiet," observed Monsieur Delacroix. "I presume there were offices we passed on the lower floors." He studied Monsieur Abimai for signs of full moon madness as he said this, but there was nothing peculiar about Monsieur Abimai's visage except its pallor. His eyes were gentle. There were no tics about his mouth. "Yes," confirmed Monsieur Abimai, "it is very quiet. At 2 or 3 in the morning you can hear every bit of chatter from the zoo. I believe I am the only resident in the whole street." "No," said Monsieur Delacroix, "there are other residents, but as it happens none of them sleep overlooking the Jardin." The point was checked by the police. "Let me show you my bedroom," said Monsieur Abimai, rising. "You will be able to see the view I have." He opened a door leading to another room, which was lined with books, even between the 2 tall windows overlooking the street. There was a bed and a table, but no wardrobe. Monsieur Delacroix saw all this in the light from the inner room. Then Monsieur Abimai shut the door, and there was darkness except from the pale light of the street lights 40 feet below. Monsieur Abimai threw open one set of the door-like windows. There was a narrow balcony outside. It seemed to Monsieur Delacroix, as he carefully leaned out of the window, that the leaves of the trees in the Jardin were a mere arm's length away. "The moon will not be full until about 10 a.m., said Monsieur Abimai. "Until then, I think I had better tell you all I know about the ennui de l'exécution." "Where is the nearest entrance to the Jardin?" asked Monsieur Delacroix, deliberately ignoring Monsieur Abimai's suggestion. Monsieur Abimai pointed a little way to the left. "Just there, on the corner of Rue Cuvier." "There's another about 100 meters down Rue Cuvier." "And to the right?" "Oh, right up at the far end of the Zoological Museum, where this street joins Rue Buffon. I have a large-scale map next door which shows all the entrances to the Jardin." The 2 men retired to the lounge, where, with the map open on the table and a glass of brandy each, they speculated upon the probable source of the light Monsieur Abimai claimed to have seen whenever there were screams from the Jardin. In this way Monsieur Delacroix prevented Monsieur Abimai from airing his particular obsession for some time. And finally, there was only time for a brief outline before it was necessary for the silent vigil to begin. They returned to the dark bedroom, carrying chairs, and sat at the open windows. An occasional car hurtled down the street below, but as 10 a.m. came and went, all noise of human life died out, leaving only faint sporadic noises from the zoo. Monsieur Abimé sat motionless at his window. Monsieur Delacroix dozed and woke in the warm air, his eyes fixed on the dark trees on the other side of the street. The city seemed pale blue, with the light of the moon now standing vertically above, but below the trees was intense black. Suddenly Delacroix realized that he was looking at several spots of yellow light through the trees, and that Abimé was gesticulating violently at him. Immediately Monsieur Delacroix shook off sleep and concentrated his attention. The light seemed to float indeterminately in a line somewhere in the direction of the cactus house, but it was impossible to know whether it was a moving light or the effect of swaying boughs in front of a stationary light. Suddenly a most appalling shriek tore Monsieur Delacroix's nerves to cringing pieces. It exploded like a magnesium flare of sound on the silent night. Delacroix involuntarily turned away in horror. Almost immediately this shriek became muffled and then ceased. Monsieur Abimé was on his feet in triumph. "There!" he called. "That's it! You heard that!" "Quick!" said Delacroix. "Let us get down to Rue Cuvier. We may see someone come from the Jardin." The elevator descended quicker than it ascended, but it still seemed funereal to Delacroix. He burst from the building and ran down the street towards the junction with Rue Cuvier. Abimé hurried behind. As they came to the junction, a small car drew away from the front of the entrance, heading their way accelerating fast. Monsieur Delacroix teetered on the curb between heroic excitement and caution, and in a second the car had roared past and away. "Don't worry," said Monsieur Abimé. "I got his number." They returned to the flat, and as a good public servant, Monsieur Delacroix forthwith reported the scream over the telephone to the police. He was told by a voice already committed to disbelief that the matter would be investigated. "You did not say anything about the car," commented Monsieur Abimé, his pale face just the faintest bit flushed with excitement. "They will not find a corpse, will they?" explained Monsieur Delacroix. "It would be infringing on a citizen's privacy to give his name uselessly to the police." Monsieur Abimé nodded silently and remained watching Monsieur Delacroix. "It will take no more than an hour for me to secure the car owner's name tomorrow," said Monsieur Delacroix, thinking as he stood. "It is quite certain that he or she is connected in some way with the scream, and I am sure that people do not scream like that unless they are being killed in some horrible way. The police have failed to find any sign of violence before. Therefore this person is very cunning, and we shall have to be equally as cunning to catch him. We must secrete ourselves in the gardens at the next full moon and watch. Are you willing to do this?" Monsieur Abimé paled again. "You don't realize how ferocious the Union d'Exécution is," he appealed. Monsieur Delacroix compressed his lips in exasperation. "You may be assured, Monsieur Abimé," he said, "that there is no cell of the Union d'Exécution in Paris. This has been checked and checked again by our police and Interpol. There is nothing. Your fears in this respect are groundless. Whatever it is we are dealing with here, it is not political assassination. Please use your head. The regularity of these, whatever they are, indicates only mania. We shall be perfectly safe if we stay together and hidden." Monsieur Abimé was unconvinced, but resigned to the fact of his own involvement. Monsieur Delacroix departed at 3 a.m. with a promise of rendezvous in a lunar month's time. The car, a little corrugated iron hunchback Citroën, was owned by Monsieur Philippe Mesdain, of Rue Le Courbet. Mademoiselle Lamoureux, who was good at this sort of thing, soon ascertained that he was a bachelor, aged 37, living with his mother, that he had played a gallant part in the Paris uprising of 1944, had trained in botany without notable results, and was now employed at the Jardin des Plantes, specializing in cactus plants. He had written a few papers for scientific journals, and one small book for the amateur on cactus growing. From the telephone operator in the Jardin des Plantes administration building, Mademoiselle, playing the part of a young woman interested in Monsieur Philippe, learned that he was a solitary kind of fellow who did a lot of voluntary overtime at the Jardin, that he had no lady friends, that he was known in the Jardin as Sandy, and that he had a little office of his own just near the back door of the building. With this smattering of knowledge, Monsieur Delacroix passed an afternoon in the Jardin, and by usual gossip with various persons working among the flower beds, he was able to get the Cactus Authority pointed out to him without the necessity of addressing him personally. Mesdain was a swarthy-faced block of a man, probably with Corsican blood, deliberate in his walk, like some tired peasant, and with a ridged brow that gave him a brooding look. He looked more like 50 than 37. There was no animation in his step. Life seemed to have beaten him. Nevertheless, thought Monsieur Delacroix, judging by those shoulders, you're as solid and strong as an ox. Mesdain entered the tropical house with his private key, and a few minutes later Monsieur Delacroix saw him through the glass erecting a ladder to examine the summit of a tall palm. I wonder what you're up to, mused Monsieur Delacroix as he walked away. Do you climb the trees and scream at the full moon? You look like an ape. Monsieur Delacroix stopped in his tracks. The possible connection with animals had not occurred to him before. Could it be that murder was committed, and then the body thrown to the lion so that no remains were found? It certainly seemed a possible explanation of the one mysterious thing about this business. Where did the bodies go if there had been 50 murders? Of course, meat for the animals. By dawn, all evidence chewed and licked up clean as a whistle. Monsieur Delacroix returned to his office, a little aghast at his explanation, but triumphant. Full moon in October fell on the first of the month. September had encountered mild weather only 2 days previous, and then it had ensued a steady strong wind from the north, pushing all summer air out of the streets. The sun fought through on both days about midday, but soon retired exhausted. The citizens of Paris now hurled their cars along the cobbled boulevards with a different kind of abandon, with a hurrying grimness, as if they felt the breath of winter close behind. Mademoiselle Lamoureux appeared in the office garbed in a thick woolen two-piece suit and numerous accessory garments to ensure protection from the blasts. Madame Delacroix categorically forbade her husband to spend the night in the Jardin des Plantes. Not that she knew the true reason for his proposed vigil. At your time of life, you must be mad. My dear, I shall be wrapped up warm, and we shall be in a sheltered place. After all, it will not be all night. Paul, you are not to go. Monsieur Delacroix expressed the overpowering flux of Uno affairs by a shrug. I must. But I shall be careful, he said miserably. As he crouched with Monsieur Abimé in the lee of the brick wall at the rear of the hot houses, Monsieur Delacroix knew his wife to be correct in calling him mad. It was as black and as cold as space beneath the trees, and his knees and shoulders ached with what felt like deposits of ice crystals. Monsieur Abimé groaned softly every now and again and prayed for a cigarette. From their height they could observe the path that passed between the Australian and cactus houses and forked left to the labyrinth and right to the administration building. The nearest loop of the path circling the hillock was a mere 5 or 6 yards away, and in the light of the full moon filtering through the trees from high above, Monsieur Delacroix was sure they would be able to definitely identify any person climbing the labyrinth. "It's midnight," breathed Monsieur Abimé. Monsieur Delacroix nodded wearily, then clutched his companion's arm. In the distance was the faint crunching and squeaking of a wheelbarrow being wheeled over the stony paths. Someone was coming from the gate by the concierge on Rue Cuvier. The noise became more distinct, and presently they could hear a peculiar mumble of conversation accompanying the harsh cracking of grit. The wheelbarrow was pushed to the foot of the path ascending into the labyrinth, and here the pusher rested. In the quiet, Monsieur Delacroix felt sure the mumbler said, "Port your helm," but the voice was so quiet and slurred that he could not believe his ears. Monsieur Abimé breathed into Delacroix's ears. "That's a drunk talking to himself." "Or a maniac," answered Monsieur Delacroix in similar fashion. The squeaks began again. The two watchers fixed their eyes upon the dappled path, and presently a black shape moved in the blackness, and became a forward-leaning figure pushing a wheelbarrow in which lay the rag-doll limp shape of another man. As the pair passed the hide, the limp shape raised its head and began cursing in a nonsensical way, only to collapse back almost immediately. The pair passed onwards into the shadows. "Did you see his face?" asked Delacroix softly. "No, it was in shadow." The noise of the barrow stopped, and there was the distant noise of a key rattling on iron as a keyhole was searched for. "He's going through the gate at the top," said Monsieur Abimé. "Shall I go after him?" "Wait," commanded Monsieur Delacroix. After a few indistinct noises, they heard the barrow returning, the slam of the gate, and then a helter-skelter skidding as the pusher rushed back along his tracks. He was past Monsieur Delacroix and Abimé before they could see his face. "I'm going up to see what he's done to that drunk," said Monsieur Abimé. "You stay here. I won't be a minute." At that precise moment a ghastly scream from above seemed to clamp a ring around their hearts. It finished on one last uprising yell of horror. Monsieur Abimé was the first to recover. He athletically clambered over the iron railings onto the path and disappeared toward the summit. Monsieur Delacroix also negotiated the railings, but clumsily, and stood trembling on the path. Suddenly he was aware that the lights of the cactus house had been switched on. This was no strange floating light. He could see the tracery of iron struts forming the skeleton of the greenhouse silhouetted against the lights inside. The murderer was performing his customary ritual. Where was Abimé? There came a second scream, more shattering than the first, since it began with a call, "Help!" but gargled into a shriek of incoherent horror and pain. Monsieur Delacroix hurled himself up the path towards the gazebo on the summit. As he ran up to the gate near the summit, he heard a tremendous thrashing going on among the shrubbery surrounding the gazebo. The spiral nature of the path still made it necessary for him to make another half turn of the hill before coming to the level top upon which the gazebo stood, and it was this which saved Monsieur Delacroix's life. Panting around this stretch of weed-grown path, with a terrifying vegetable noise going on only a yard to his right, fear had time to give him caution. He stopped and peered into the dappled light around the gazebo. he saw the half-severed body of Monsieur Abîmé hanging in the myriad toothed jaws of a gigantic snake. The tube of the snake's body was already distended where it had begun to ingest Monsieur Abîmé, and it convulsed with a prodigious effort of crushing the bones in his limbs. Monsieur Delacroix nearly fainted. He reeled back into the bushes, then sick and panic-stricken, rushed down the spiral path to the lighted beacon of the cactus house. Blindly he dragged open the heavy iron-framed door of the greenhouse and fell into the heat and light. Philippe Madame was on his knees before one of the tree-like cacti. "Help!" rattled Monsieur Delacroix, staggering. "In the labyrinth, oh God! Monster!" Philippe Madame stood up, his face twisted with emotion. He had some kind of short gardening tool in his hand. With this he struck Monsieur Delacroix across the head. "Fool!" he shouted. He struck Monsieur Delacroix again and again with his full bull-like strength. Too late, Monsieur Delacroix realized his folly. He collapsed unconscious upon the concrete floor. When consciousness had pushed its way up to the surface through layers of pain and sickness, Monsieur Delacroix found himself propped against one of the walls of the greenhouse, with his ankles tied together and his arms tied behind his back. Madame was busy at the base of the cactus tree, working with the flitting motions of a barber around a rich client. He had a pad on which he wrote figures after consulting certain spots in the trunk of the cactus, and he also had a syringe which he plunged into the plant to draw off liquid. Between these motions he circled the trunk, fingering the scale-like spines, and exhibiting nervous anticipation, as if he expected some miraculous metamorphosis to take place at any moment. Suddenly he stood back, almost falling over Monsieur Delacroix's legs. "Ah!" he exclaimed. He stretched his arms up towards the crest of the cactus like a pagan priest welcoming the sun. Monsieur Delacroix was amazed to see the triangular scales forming the bark near the summit of the cactus trunk, lifting and falling back as if puffs of air agitated from them from within. This motion quickly spread down the trunk until the 20-foot column was covered with rhythmic pulses of movement. "This time," appealed Madame to the quivering plant. He clenched his fist and visibly willed the plant to do something. Suddenly there was a noise like tearing cloth, and the dirty green of the bark parted at the summit, and from the yard-long split welled out a most stupendous blossom of tightly packed petals. Simultaneously Monsieur Delacroix breathed in such a powerful perfume that his eyes closed in a paroxysm of delight. The flower burst open in a stunning flamboyance of red and yellow, rustling like a silken umbrella being opened. Madame fell to his knees at Delacroix's side. "What do you think of my lovely?" he breathed. "It's incredible," answered Delacroix sincerely. "Worth killing for," amplified Madame with enthusiasm. Delacroix remained silent, not knowing what to answer. The flower gave out dense waves of perfume, so disturbing to the senses that Monsieur Delacroix felt the onset of that fever-like disorientation that comes with drugging. "She must feed," shouted Madame, "so I kill for her." Without looking at Monsieur Delacroix, Madame went on. "You know what she is. She's a survivor from the Miocene. I reared her myself from a seed." He laughed. "That's one thing we have to thank the war for, dropping a blockbuster so that it blew the insides out of a hill in which a seed had been imprisoned for 40 million years. I found her sprouting there, on the side of the crater, near the corpse of a cow." He laughed uproariously. "I recognized a stranger and I potted her. Even then her root was a size. It took me 5 years to realize that she was unique on this earth. I went back and investigated the place where I had found Selina. Madame checked momentarily at the realization that he had revealed his secret name for the plant. There was a railway tunnel through the hill, and this bomb had pierced the covering of rock and exploded in the tunnel, literally blowing out the heart of the hill. It was all pure Miocene stuff. That, and the resemblance to some fossil pieces that can be found in most museums, convinced me. She was a prehistoric fern. Madame closed his eyes, then breathed deeply of the scent which filled the greenhouse. He smiled evilly with his eyes still closed. "She likes blood," he said. "I found that out one day when I was repotting her. She has a tubular root that is mobile along its length and toothed all the way along inside, like a barracuda's mouth. And as I lifted her out of the old pot, the root came free and took the end off my finger. She loved it. She grew 6 inches overnight. After that, I got the idea and fed her mice and things of that size. There was no holding her. It became impossible to keep her potted in my apartment, so I moved her into here. You understand. And by the time she was a big girl, people thought she had been here all the time." Madame laughed convulsively at that. Tears ran down his face. "Of course she tried to have her root free for hunting in the greenhouse, but I had to discourage that. I kept burying the root until she was forced to burrow under the walls and outside. I lost her for several years after that. The root, I mean. Until one night she caught a tramp who had gone into the gazebo for a sleep. I was washing her down at the time, and I heard the screaming. Then she seemed to come alive under my hands. I realized the connection at once, and before the noise had stopped, I found out where her true root was. The meal transfigured her. She bloomed like you see her. For the first time in her life, she bloomed. What an amazing sight! What an incredible phenomenon! Flower for 2 to 3 hours, and then an explosion of seed. I collected every one of those seeds, and on every subsequent occasion on which I have been able to make her bloom. Millions of seeds, I have sacks of them. Every one potentially a beauty like my Selina. Soon I shall embark on my pilgrimage of planting them all over Europe. The Miocene shall be born again." Monsieur Delacroix, who had been listening to Madame and watching the plant in a semi-coma, was suddenly speared through by the realization that Madame could not tell him all this and allow him to live. Madame seemed to be recalled from his dream too. He turned his head and looked at Monsieur Delacroix. "She has never had 3 bodies in one night," he whispered. "I wonder what she will do." "No," croaked Monsieur Delacroix. Madame fetched the wheelbarrow, and despite his wiggling bundled Monsieur Delacroix into it, he stuffed a handkerchief into Monsieur Delacroix's mouth and secured the plug with some scrim. "We must hurry," he told Monsieur Delacroix. "Once the flower drops, she will not feed until another full moon." Monsieur Delacroix was too horror-struck to reflect on the humor of Madame's use of the word "we." Come what may, he was going to do the most ghastly death conceivable. There was no hope of help. Abime no more now than fertilizer for the plant, as was the hapless drunk before him. Only his wife knew of his intention to watch in the labyrinth, and she would be now deeply asleep. Tears sprang to Monsieur Delacroix's eyes as he said good-bye to his wife. Madame wheeled him through the gate left open in Delacroix's frantic escape. They began the last dozen or so yards of ascent. The moonlight was still as strong in the open, and the shadows as black beneath the bushes. Monsieur Delacroix became almost demented in his writhings as they came to the end of the path, at the edge of the small clearing around the gazebo. If he had not been gagged, he would have shrieked his fear of that terrible mouth lurking somewhere in the bushes, but all that came from him were vague mumbles. "Selina!" called Madame coaxingly. He stepped on the grass. "She can't hear, you understand," he explained to Delacroix. "She is sensitive to vibrations in the ground. Selina! Selina!" There was a rustle in the bracken to one side of the gazebo, and then with a rush the great mouth reared up into the moonlight, weaving from side to side like some stupendous cobra. "Ah!" shouted Madame in adoration, and pushed the wheelbarrow nearer. The blind mouth swished over Delacroix, missing his recumbent body by a few inches. He had a momentary look right down that fibrous tube, and saw the glint of hundreds of spines moving with a wave-like motion into the blackness. The tube was growing longer with every second, smoothly expanding from the hole under the gazebo. It waved high into the air, right above the two men, seeming to yearn at the bright moon overhead. Madame stamped his foot again. The mouth seemed to look downward. Its ghastly, thorn-like maw gaped wider, and then it dived down, mouth fully extended, and swallowed Madame completely. Delacroix, rigid with terror, was knocked from the wheelbarrow by the convulsions of the plant. He rolled into the bushes near the entrance to the path, and watched in horror the bulge of Madame pass downward into the earth. The mouth lay prone on the ground in satiation, and then slowly contracted back into its burrow. Delacroix writhed to his knees, and with the strength of panic gained his bound feet and hopped from the clearing. He moved in huge staggering hops round the spiral to the gate, then fell on the wider public path and rolled. His senses became blurred and eventually left him. He lay senseless, bound hand and foot halfway to the foot of the mound. Just after dawn, one of the gardeners passing near the labyrinth on his way to look at the tropical house furnace heard Monsieur Delacroix's groan. Monsieur Delacroix was very feeble with cold and cramp, and not very intelligible. The gardener spread his thick coat over Delacroix, then went off to phone the police and an ambulance. The gardener returned with a bottle of brandy and a pair of secateurs. He cut the innumerable strands of string that bound Monsieur Delacroix's wrists and ankles, then helped him to sit up and drink from the bottle. Both the restored circulation and the brandy were agony, and Monsieur Delacroix fainted again. An hour later, in a private room in a nearby hospital, he was able to tell his story to a policeman. The man had him repeat the story, asking only short questions from time to time. He then went off, and to Monsieur Delacroix's consternation, Madame Delacroix was then admitted. The ensuing scene was astonishing for the mixture of tenderness and temper. Monsieur Delacroix was forced to admit his own imbecility in undertaking to sit up all night in the jardin at this time of the year. At length he was asked to tell what had happened. Madame Delacroix looked at him with increasing bewilderment. "Are you joking, Paul?" she interrupted. "No, my dear," he replied. "What I tell you is true." Madame Delacroix burst out crying. "Oh, my poor Paul!" she sobbed. The nurse came in and administered a potent sleeping draught, then led Madame away. As he slipped into sleep, Monsieur Delacroix realized with dismay that neither his wife nor the policeman had believed him. There was another visit the next day from a more superior police officer, accompanied by a doctor, who sat listening intently to everything that passed Monsieur Delacroix's lips, but only made comment with his eyes. Monsieur Delacroix found himself watching the doctor when making his replies and endeavoring to make his story less spectacular, but there is little that can be done to make a man-eating plant appear mundane. The police officer stood up and retrieved his cap from the bedside table. "It is an astonishing story, monsieur," he said. "The only part we have been able to confirm so far is that Philippe Madame has not been seen since the evening on which you claim the events took place, although his car has been found in Rue Cuvier, outside the Jardin. Also, we have not been able to find Monsieur Abimé, but he appears to have been a man of somewhat peculiar ways, and may have taken it into his mind to go off. Never fear, monsieur, we shall investigate every aspect of your account until we arrive at the truth. Monsieur Delacroix was rather put out by this ambiguous statement. Have you found no blood by that gazebo? He exclaimed despairingly. No, monsieur, replied the officer briskly. Now please excuse us, we shall return again. The ensuing week was the most depressing Monsieur Delacroix remembered spending. He was most courteously imprisoned in the hospital, despite all his vehement assurances that he was well. They were apparently afraid of shock. The doctor lectured Monsieur Delacroix on the mysterious unpredictability and dreadfulness of shock. At your age, you are more prone to after effects than at any age, he affirmed. It would be, we shall not say suicidal, but most certainly extremely dangerous, for you to resume your normal life until the body has had a chance to adjust. Is it shock or mania you are afraid of? Asked Monsieur Delacroix, with a bitterness that was most unusual for him. Never have I heard of a physically well man being detained in a hospital at government expense just in case he should experience a reaction. If I had been assaulted by a thief instead of a mad botanist, I have no doubt but that I should have been released the first day. You believe I am mad, and that I have made away with 2 men. The doctor moved to the door. The police are checking your story for truth. I am only interested in you as a medical patient, and I know you are unwell. Please try to rest. Good day. Unwell? The euphemism did not deceive Monsieur Delacroix. He questioned Madame Delacroix closely about her conversation with the police and with the matron of the ward. He persisted in an attempt to make her admit that she herself thought him mad, until she exhausted the number of ways of saying no, and cut short her visit in exasperation. Monsieur Delacroix spent one day lying on his back in silent despair, examining all the signs of madness within his mind. He spoke to no one, and drank only 1 cup of coffee the whole day. Eventually the police officer reappeared, accompanied once more by the doctor. The door was fastened behind them. The officer would not sit down, and stood stiffly beside the bed with his light grey eyes, pinning Monsieur Delacroix to the pillow. We have completed our investigation, he announced. We have found the bodies of Monsieur Abimé and Madame. From the corner of his eyes Monsieur Delacroix could see the face of the doctor fixed rigid like a staring, undercoloured tailor's dummy. His heart seemed to turn over. He knew that the bodies had been found in circumstances that incriminated him. His mind suffered a sudden confusion of thoughts that centred upon the certainty that, after all, he was mad, and the whole terrible night was an illusion thrown up by his guilty mind to drown out the actual crime. What had he done? Are you all right, monsieur? Queried the doctor, in concern. He took Monsieur Delacroix's wrist. The police officer remained silent, keeping his unwavering eyes on Monsieur Delacroix, while the doctor counted out the pulse. A drink of water, said the doctor, and helped Monsieur Delacroix to take it. Go on, croaked Monsieur Delacroix. It took time because we had to obtain permission from the directorate of the Jardin for our every move, and the officer. But we dug up the gazebo. We found the tube. I was there when we found it. Monsieur, you must have had a terrifying experience. Oh, said Monsieur Delacroix, closing his eyes. His relief was so intense that tears ran from beneath his lids. Fortunately, the thing was inert and did not attack us. We obtained permission and dug up the cactus described by yourself. The remains of both men were found in a sack at the base of the plant. It is thought that some chemical that Marlene kept about himself as a protection from the plant poisoned it. The plant was already beginning to decay when we dug it up. Oh, sighed Monsieur Delacroix. He looked at the police officer through the distorting lenses of his tears. That was a terrible experience for you." "One gets used to such things," said the officer grimly. "So I'm not mad?" murmured Monsieur Delacroix. "Am I free?" "Of course, monsieur," answered the officer. "You have not been a prisoner. Of course you are free." Monsieur Delacroix looked at the doctor, who shrugged as he stood up. "I think you may go." The two men left. The nurse opened the door and ushered in Monsieur Delacroix's full family. The youngest child bore a giant bouquet of flowers. Monsieur Delacroix shrieked and fell back into the bed. The doctor re-entered almost immediately. "That's better," he observed with satisfaction, as he stooped over the trembling Delacroix. "Didn't I tell you about the dangers of shock?"